Evan Marshall had lived in the same quiet Portland neighborhood for almost 20 years. His life was simple: mornings with coffee, days filled with work, and quiet evenings watching the sun fade behind the trees. He wasn't lonely exactly, but life had become predictable. Across the street lived the Thompsons, a cheerful family who always seemed to bring color to the block. Their house was full of laughter, garden smells, and the sound of life. Evan often watched them from his porch, not out of curiosity, but because they reminded him of everything bright and alive in the world. Among them was Lily Thompson, the youngest daughter, a little girl with wild brown curls, always carrying a sketchbook and a world of imagination in her eyes. She'd often sit on the curb, drawing on the pavement with chalk while her mother watered flowers and her father washed the car. Evan would sometimes wave, and she would wave back shyly, smiling with that kind of pure warmth only children have. He remembered her growing up year by year. First, the small bicycle with pink handles. Then the high school years when she'd rush out every morning, backpack bouncing behind her, hair tied in a loose ponytail. She'd wave politely if their eyes met, and he'd smile back, watching from his porch like someone quietly witnessing time pass. The neighborhood changed slowly. New people came. Some left, but the Thompsons stayed. They were the kind of family everyone admired. On weekends, they'd host small cookouts, laughter spilling into the street. Evan was always invited, but usually gave polite excuses, saying he was busy or tired. In truth, he wasn't much for crowds. He liked peace, stillness, things that didn't rush him. But Lily had a way of drawing even quiet people out. She'd often walk over with a plate of pie her mother baked, insisting he try some. "You shouldn't stay in all the time, Mr. Marshall," she'd tease. "You'll turn into a ghost." He'd laugh, thank her, and sometimes they'd chat for a minute or two. She'd tell him about school, her art projects, her dreams of becoming a painter. He would listen, quietly admiring her spark, that energy of someone who believed the world was full of possibilities. As the years passed, Evan watched her change. She wasn't the little girl with chalk-stained hands anymore. She was growing into herself, confident, expressive, and graceful. Sometimes he'd see her sitting under the maple tree with her sketchbook, painting the sky or the street. The way she looked at the world with so much wonder reminded him of everything he'd once loved about being young. Evan was in his late 30s then, and though he never admitted it out loud, he found himself caring about her more than he should. It wasn't romantic at first, more a quiet fondness, the kind people feel when they've watched someone grow from innocence into strength. But it carried a weight that surprised him. One summer evening, when the sky was burning orange and pink, Lily waved at him from across the street. She was older now, maybe 18 or 19. Returning from somewhere, her hair caught the light, and her eyes held a kind of confidence he hadn't seen before. When their eyes met, she smiled. Not like a child anymore, but like someone who understood more of life. Something in that moment shifted for him. It was as if time paused, and he suddenly saw her not as the girl across the street, but as a young woman who had grown up right before his eyes. He looked away quickly, unsure of what he felt. It wasn't wrong, but it made him thoughtful, aware. It reminded him how time moves quietly, reshaping everything, including how we see people. The summer went on, and he found himself noticing her more often, not intentionally, but in small, harmless ways. The way she laughed with her friends, her voice light and genuine. The way she helped her parents carry groceries, or how she always said hello to everyone, no matter how busy she was. She was kind, grounded, something rare in a world that often rushed past the simple things. Sometimes he wondered what kind of life she'd have, where her art would take her, who she'd become. He hoped she'd never lose that light in her eyes. But there were moments when he felt an ache he couldn't name. Maybe it was just the realization of getting older, watching someone else's life bloom while his stayed still. There was beauty in it, but also a kind of quiet sadness. He didn't want to interfere, didn't even want to speak it aloud. He just watched from a respectful distance, the way one watches the seasons change. One evening, as he sat by the window, he saw her sitting on her porch steps, sketchbook in hand, drawing something on the blank page. When she noticed him looking, she smiled softly and lifted her book as if showing him her work. He couldn't see the drawing from where he sat. But that small gesture, the way she wanted to share a piece of her world with him, made his heart feel strangely full. He smiled back, raising his coffee cup in return. She laughed quietly, and he heard her voice drift through the still evening air. "You should come see it sometime." He wanted to, but he didn't move. Maybe he was afraid to break the simple, it's perfect distance between them, the unspoken understanding that sometimes watching is enough. That night, he couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about how fast time had gone, how the little girl with chalk-stained fingers had turned into someone bold and bright, and how, somehow, in all those years, he had started to see her as more than a memory passing by his window. It wasn't love, not yet. It was something softer, a quiet admiration mixed with a sense of loss. Because for the first time, he realized how much he'd missed living while simply watching life happen around him. He thought about going over, saying something, but the thought faded as quickly as it came. She had her whole future ahead of her, and he had his quiet life, his solitude. But as he turned off the light and glanced once more out the window, he saw her porch light still on. She was sitting there, sketchbook in hand, lost in her world again. And though they were separated by a street and a few decades of time, something about that moment felt connected. Like two souls quietly recognizing each other across the years. He didn't know what it meant or where it would lead. But as he closed the curtains, a faint smile touched his lips. For the first time in a long while, life didn't feel so still anymore. And somewhere deep down, a thought whispered quietly, "Some people walk into your life so softly. You don't even realize they've changed it until much later." Evan didn't know it yet, but this was just the beginning. The beginning of something time itself would have to shape slow, unexpected, and quietly bold. After that summer, Lily left for college. The street grew quieter, without her laughter echoing through the evenings. Evan noticed the silence more than he wanted to admit. Her parents still waved when they saw him, still smiled like always. But the warmth that once spilled out of their home had dimmed. The porch where Lily used to sit with her sketchbook now looked empty, like a memory left behind. Evan returned to his steady routines early mornings. Quiet workdays, long evenings with only the hum of the fridge for company. Sometimes he'd catch himself glancing across the street out of habit, expecting to see her drawing or waving. But the yard stayed still. The lights came on later, and the world seemed to move without her. He told himself it was normal. People grow up, move on. But the thought left a strange ache he couldn't quite explain. Years began to pass. Seasons changed, one after another. Every spring, the maple trees would bloom again, filling the air with soft green light. And every year, Evan would hear updates about Lily. Her parents often spoke proudly about her art exhibitions, her city life, her ambition. He listened quietly, smiling, never asking too much. But deep down, he was always curious. Sometimes, when he passed by their mailbox, he'd see envelopes with Lily's name on them, postmarked from New York, Chicago, San Francisco. The world was clearly opening up for her, and that made him happy. She had become what she always dreamed of, an artist living beyond small-town lines. Still, a small part of him missed the girl who used to paint sunsets on the sidewalk. Then one morning, after years of hearing only about her, he saw her again. It was early spring, soft rain falling, when a car pulled into the Thompsons' driveway. The door opened, and there she was. No longer the girl he remembered, but a woman with quiet confidence. She wore a simple gray coat, her hair tied back, eyes filled with calm strength. Time had shaped her, but in the best way. When she noticed him standing by his fence, she smiled immediately. "Mr. Marshall," she said warmly, "you haven't changed at all." Evan chuckled softly. "I think time disagrees with you." She laughed, a sound he hadn't realized he'd missed. "Maybe just a little. But you still look the same to me." Strange at first, seeing her grown up and standing before him again. Yet it also felt natural, like picking up a conversation that had paused for a few years. She told him she'd finished her degree and was visiting her parents for a few months before deciding her next move. He listened, genuinely happy to hear her voice again, and surprised by how easy it felt to talk to her. From that day, they started meeting more often. Sometimes she'd cross the street with coffee cups in hand, saying she needed company while painting. Other times she'd ask him for advice, not because she needed it, but because she liked hearing his thoughts. They talked about books, about places she'd seen, about how time changes people. He told her small things about his own life, how he once dreamed of traveling but stayed behind to take care of his parents, how he never married, how the quiet suited him but sometimes felt too heavy. Lily listened closely, her eyes soft, her attention full. She didn't treat him like an older man or just a neighbor. She treated him like someone she respected, someone she understood. Their conversations were never rushed. They would sit on his porch as the sun dipped low, golden light spilling over the street. There was laughter, sometimes silence, and occasionally a feeling that hovered between friendship and something else neither could name. Evan tried to ignore it. That strange pull he felt when she smiled, the warmth that lingered long after she left. He reminded himself that she was still young, her life unfolding, while his had already settled. But emotions aren't always reasonable. They arrive quietly, without asking permission. One evening, as they watched the sky fade into deep purple, Lily said softly, "It's strange, isn't it? How people change, and yet some stay in your story no matter how far you go." Evan looked at her, her words echoing in his mind. "Maybe that's what makes life beautiful," he said. "Some stories don't end, they just pause for a while." She smiled at him, and for a moment neither looked away. There was something gentle in her eyes, a kind of recognition, as if she felt the same unspoken bond he did, but just as quickly. She broke the moment, glancing toward her house. "I should go. Mom will think I've kidnapped you with my endless talking." He laughed. "I think I can handle it." "Tomorrow, then?" she asked, half smiling. "Tomorrow," he replied. That night Evan couldn't sleep. He sat by his window again, watching the street glow under the streetlight. He thought about the years between then and now, how much had changed, and how easily old connections could return. He didn't want to overthink it. But something about her being back made the world feel alive again in the following weeks. Their friendship deepened naturally. There was no need for grand gestures, just moments shared quietly, like threads weaving something real. Sometimes she'd bring him her sketches, asking his opinion. Other times they'd talk about dreams that never happened. And how maybe some weren't meant to. One afternoon, she showed him a painting she had made a view of their street from her childhood perspective. His house stood across from hers, painted softly in golden tones. She smiled shyly and said, "This was my view growing up. You were always there reading or sitting outside. I think I drew you more times than I realized." Evan didn't know what to say. His throat tightened slightly. "You noticed that much?" She nodded. "You were part of the neighborhood to me. The quiet one who always looked like he was listening to the world." He smiled faintly, feeling something stir in his chest, a mix of pride, surprise, and affection as the days went on. Evan began to realize how much he looked forward to seeing her. Her presence brought color into his quiet world again. She made him laugh, made him think, made him remember how it felt to really live. Yet under the calm, there was a truth neither of them spoke, that this connection, no matter how innocent, carried a weight they couldn't ignore. There was a space between them, shaped by years, by experience, by unspoken understanding. Still, neither wanted to break it. Then, one evening near the end of spring, she told him something that made the air still. "I got a call from a gallery in New York," she said. "They want to feature my work. It's a big opportunity. I think I'm going to take it." He forced a smile. "That's wonderful, Lily. You should." She looked at him quietly, as if searching for something in his face. "You always say that, like you're proud, but far away." He hesitated. "Maybe because I've learned to care quietly." For a moment, neither spoke. There was only the sound of wind moving through the trees. Then she smiled softly, her eyes bright with emotion. "I'll write to you," she said, and she did. But that night, after she left, Evan sat on his porch long after the lights went out. He didn't know if he'd ever see her again, but he was grateful. Grateful that he'd been part of her story. Even if just as the quiet neighbor across the street, some loves aren't loud or obvious. Some exist in silences, in glances. In the quiet comfort of knowing someone's presence matters, even when distance grows between them. And as the days passed, Evan realized something sometimes. Watching someone you care for grow bolder doesn't mean losing them. It means learning how to love them without needing to hold on. Years passed quietly after Lily moved to New York. The street felt different without her around. The Thompsons still lived there, but even they seemed older, slower, their house not as bright as before. Evan continued with his usual life, simple, calm, predictable. Yet sometimes, while drinking his morning coffee, he'd think about her, wondering how she was, whether her art had taken her far, or if she ever thought of the old neighborhood she once called home. He didn't expect to see her again, not really. People moved on, found new worlds. But life has its quiet surprises. One autumn afternoon, when the air smelled of rain and wood smoke, Evan saw her again. She was standing in her parents' driveway, suitcase beside her, talking to her mother. Her hair was shorter, her style different, more polished, more grown up, but her smile was still the same. When she turned and noticed him, her face lit up like old times. "Evan Marshall," she said, crossing the street before he could even wave. "Do you still drink coffee every morning at exactly 7?" He laughed softly. "Some habits never die." "Good," she smiled. "Then you won't mind sharing a cup tomorrow." It wasn't a question. It was an invitation that carried the warmth of memory. And so, the next morning, she came over. They sat on his porch just like before, but the conversations were different now. She talked about New York, her exhibitions, the rush of city life, the exhaustion that came with chasing dreams. She spoke with honesty, not pride, and he listened, quietly admiring her courage. In return, she asked him about his life, about the years she'd missed. He told her the truth that not much had changed. He still worked, still enjoyed the quiet, still found comfort in small things. She smiled softly. "You always were steady. I used to envy that." As days turned into weeks, their meetings became more frequent. She'd come over in the evenings, sometimes bringing dinner, sometimes just stories. Their connection felt natural, effortless. It wasn't about romance, not yet. It was about companionship, the kind that grows when two people understand each other without needing to say everything out loud. Evan noticed how different she was now, stronger, more self. The girl who once dreamed of painting the sky had turned into a woman who had actually done it. And yet there was still something tender in her eyes. She laughed easily, but sometimes when she looked at the horizon, there was a flicker of longing, the kind only someone who's seen too much of the world carries. One evening, she told him she'd come home to rest. New York was a lot, she admitted. The shows went well, but I felt lost. I needed to remember where I started. He nodded. Sometimes going forward means going back a little. She smiled, her eyes glinting in the fading light. "You always know how to make things sound simple." They sat in silence for a while, watching the sun dip low behind the rooftops. The air between them carried a calm that words couldn't touch. Over the next few months, they fell into a rhythm. Shared mornings, occasional walks by the river, long talks about life and choices. People in the neighborhood began to notice. The quiet man across the street and the grown-up daughter of the Thompsons spending time together. Some whispered, some smiled knowingly. Evan ignored it. Lily did too. They both knew what it was, a friendship that had deep roots. Still, deep down, something gentle was changing. He felt it in the way his heart lifted when she laughed. She felt it in the way his quiet steadiness grounded her restless spirit. Neither said anything, afraid that naming it would break the fragile balance they'd found. But time has a way of pushing people to face what they feel. One chilly evening, Lily showed up with a look of excitement and hesitation. "I have news," she said, sitting beside him. "A gallery in New York wants me back. Not just for a show, they want me to stay, to manage a new exhibit. It's everything I worked for." Evan smiled, proud, but heavy-hearted. That's incredible. You've earned it. She looked at him closely. You always say that like you're proud of me, but you're not really here. Took a slow breath. Maybe because I've learned that caring for someone doesn't mean holding them back. For a moment, neither spoke. The quiet stretched between them, filled with everything they didn't say. She finally whispered, "Sometimes you make it too easy to leave." He looked at her, eyes soft but steady. And sometimes that's the only way to love someone, right? Tears shimmered in her eyes, but she smiled. You always find the right words. Few days later, she was gone again. Off to New York, off to her dreams. She hugged her parents goodbye, then crossed the street one last time. "Thank you, Evan," she said quietly, "for seeing me when I was still trying to see myself." He nodded, unable to find words. She placed her hand on his arm for a brief second, a touch full of meaning, then walked away. He stood there long after the car disappeared down the street. The days that followed felt emptier. The porch, the coffee, even the quiet, all of it felt different now. He didn't regret anything, but her absence left a space that nothing else filled. Sometimes he'd imagine her walking by again, sketchbook in hand, smiling the way she used to. He followed her career through small mentions online, seeing her name on articles and interviews. Each time he felt a strange mix of pride and distance, like watching a bird he'd once sheltered finally soar high. Yet, despite her success, he often felt that she'd left a piece of herself behind in this street. This neighborhood, this quiet connection they once shared. One evening, months later, as he sat outside with his coffee, he noticed something unusual, a small envelope tucked under his front door. Inside was a simple note written in her neat handwriting. It said, "New York is louder this time. Brighter too. But some nights when it gets too much, I think of the porch, the coffee, and the quiet. I think of the way you made stillness feel safe. Thank you for being my calm when the world spun too fast." Evan read the letter several times. No promises, no confessions, just truth, honest and gentle. He placed it on the shelf near his window beside an old photograph of the neighborhood. In that moment, he realized something, that not all love stories are about togetherness. Some are about connection, the kind that stays alive even when people walk different roads. Lily had taught him that life isn't about clinging. It's about witnessing. He went back to his porch, the evening quiet around him, and watched the streetlights flicker on one by one. The world hadn't changed much, but he had. His heart felt fuller, steadier. He didn't know if she would ever come back again, but he didn't need to. Because somewhere out there in a busy city far away was someone who had once been the little girl across the street, and now a woman who carried a piece of his heart wherever she went. And as he watched the night settle over the neighborhood, Evan whispered to himself, some stories don't end. They just find new chapters written in different skies. That was how he lived from then on, quietly, gratefully, carrying her memory like a soft light that time could never dim. The years kept moving, soft and steady, like the river that ran beyond the neighborhood. Seasons changed, people came and went, and Evan Marshall grew older, not bitter, not lonely, just quieter. He had learned to live with memories instead of moments. The porch was still his favorite place, though now the wood creaked a little more. And his coffee cup felt heavier in the mornings. Across the street, the Thompson house stood mostly silent. After Lily left for good, her parents eventually sold it and moved to Florida. The house was painted over, new people moved in, and the laughter that once filled it was gone. But for Evan, the place always looked the same, as if it still held the echoes of the past. But a girl with a sketchbook who had once waved from the porch. Life carried on. Evan worked less, read more, and tried to enjoy the stillness he had once taken for granted. He didn't expect surprises anymore. But life, as it often does, had one waiting for him. It was an ordinary autumn afternoon. The air was cool, golden leaves scattered on the ground. Evan was trimming the small hedge near his driveway when he heard a familiar voice call his name, soft, uncertain, but unmistakable. Evan. He turned slowly. For a moment, he thought his mind was playing tricks on him. But there she was, Lily, standing by the old maple tree, a gentle smile on her lips. Time had changed her again. Her hair was shorter, streaked with lighter tones. Her face more defined, carrying the grace of a woman who had lived fully. Yet her eyes, those same eyes, still carried warmth, depth, and something unspoken. He set the trimmer aside, still stunned. "Lily, I didn't think," she smiled, finishing his thought. "That you'd see me again? I wasn't sure myself." They stood for a moment, both unsure what to say next. Then, like the old days, she crossed the street. "I was driving through town for an art event," she explained, "and I couldn't just pass by. I had to see if you were still here." "I'm still here," he said quietly. "Still on this porch, still drinking too much coffee." She laughed softly. "I'm glad some things never change." They sat together like no time had passed. The air carried that same calm that used to exist between them years ago. Natural, wordless, warm. She told him about her life, how she had built a small art studio by the coast. How her work was finally bringing peace instead of pressure. She had achieved what she'd wanted. Yet her tone carried a quiet maturity. "Success feels different now," she admitted. "It's not about being seen anymore. It's about being understood." Evan listened, smiling with quiet pride. "That's when you know you've grown," he said. "When peace matters more than applause." They talked for hours, sharing stories about time, mistakes, and lessons learned. She asked about him, too, his work, his health, the neighborhood. He told her about his quiet life, the books that kept him company, and how he sometimes painted small landscapes now, something she had unknowingly inspired years ago. When she heard that, her eyes softened. "You paint. Not like you," he chuckled. "Just small things. Sunsets, trees, maybe this street sometimes. It keeps my hands busy. I'd love to see them," she said, smiling with genuine warmth. He hesitated, then nodded. He led her inside, where on the wall above his small desk hung a few simple paintings. One of the street, one of the river, and one of a porch with a figure sitting quietly. Facing the sunset, she stopped in front of that last one. Her voice trembled slightly. "Is that me?" He nodded slowly. "From memory. You used to sit there, right where the light hit your face. I painted it years ago." She turned toward him, eyes glistening. "You remembered that?" "I remember everything," he said softly. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was deep, almost sacred. They both felt the weight of time, how it had changed them, yet somehow kept them connected. Later, they returned to the porch. The sun had dipped low, painting the street in gold. The same maple leaves drifted between them, just like the day she first waved at him long ago. Lily looked around, her expression thoughtful. "You know, I always thought I'd outgrow this street," she said quietly. "But now that I'm here again, it feels like home never left me." "Maybe home isn't a place," Evan said gently. "Maybe it's the people we find along the way." She smiled, eyes glimmering. "And maybe it's the people who wait without asking us to stay." He looked at her then, really looked. Time had carved years into both their faces, but it had also softened the distance between them. The affection that had once been quiet and careful now felt calm and certain as evening deepened. They sat in silence, the porch light flickering on. She leaned back in her chair, her voice low. "You've grown older, Evan," he smiled faintly. "And you've grown bolder." Her laughter carried through the cool air, soft and genuine. "Maybe I learned that from watching you." They stayed there for hours, watching the night rise around them. No big declarations, no dramatic confessions, just two souls who had met again after walking separate paths. Both wiser, both gentler, both ready to finally understand what their connection meant. When it was time for her to go, she stood by her car looking at him across the small distance that had once felt like miles. "Don't get too comfortable," she said with a teasing smile. "I'm not disappearing this time." He laughed quietly, heart light. "I'll hold you to that." She nodded, eyes soft. "You always do." Then she drove away into the night, the taillights fading down the familiar road. Evan stood there long after the sound of her car disappeared, the crisp air wrapping around him. Something in him felt alive again, not the restless longing of the past, but a calm, steady hope. That night he couldn't sleep, not because of sadness or confusion, but because life suddenly felt new again. He sat by the window, looking across the street, the same view he had watched for decades. The leaves shimmered under the moonlight, and he thought of her words, "I'm not disappearing this time." In that quiet moment, he realized that life has a way of returning what's meant to stay. Maybe not in the same form, maybe not in the same timing, but always when hearts are ready. The next morning, he woke up early. For the first time in years, he brewed 2 cups of coffee instead of one and placed them both on the porch table. Just in case she came by and somehow, he knew she would. Because some connections, no matter how long they sleep, always find their way back older, wiser, and bolder. And as the sun rose over the same street that had witnessed their story from the very beginning, Evan smiled softly to himself. Love, he realized, isn't about how long it lasts in time. It's about how deeply it stays in the heart. And his heart, after all these years, was still waiting, not with longing anymore, but with quiet faith that some stories don't end. They just come full circle.